Okay. Waiting on folks to sign on, and then I will get started. Although, I guess I could do one thing to get us started, which is to, since we've got some folks in the chat already, how about we do this? So there, first of all, welcome to class. Second of all, last week I gave you all an assignment for the weekend, which was to watch again, I call it like competitive creative show, whatever you want to. I mean, I'm sure there's like a genre of TV that this is. So I guess, while we're waiting on people to filter in, those of you who are here, type into the chat and, tell me like what show you watched and then maybe some things you noticed about, again, like, were the challenges weighted more towards technical or creative in the episodes you watched? And that's important because, like, please note, sometimes they shift over the course of a season. What kind of judging, like what was the balance of those things in judging? Did you notice anything in particular about, was it objective, subjective? Did you notice anything in particular about the judging or what people were looking for on those shows? And we can talk about, what that balance is. So, while you're typing that in, today what we're going to concentrate on is I'm going to talk about Project 2, and I shared some resources in our Discord server yesterday, but we can talk about like what those are and why you need them. And then we're also like with the remaining time, there's a short presentation today that gives some like basics about the idea of narrative in games. This is one area where I am not an expert, and I say that like I tell stories with my games, but I say this to acknowledge that there is a whole vast like section of game making and game studies occupied by really amazing, talented, knowledgeable people. And that is their specialty, and I am not in that specialty, so I don't want to be like, pretend to be some sort of authority on it. When, frankly, like storytelling in games could probably be like 3 or 4 courses if somebody was really allowed to like go hog wild with it. Watch Great British Baking Show. In the show, there's a technical round and a more creative round. I noticed creativity can only go so far if you fail repeatedly. Ooh, that's a really interesting point. So, yeah, let's talk about these. So first of all, it's like there is this technical versus the because like here's the thing. The reason I had you watch these is that so design is universal. And this gets back into the idea that I talk about a lot, which is that, I hear a lot of people say like, oh, I'm designing and, like I'm doing design. And when you talk to them, what you really realize is that in that person's mind, design is operating software to make a thing. And that's not design. Now, you might design using that software as a tool, but ultimately design is this process of being given some set of criteria and then responding to that criteria via making a thing, bringing a thing into fruition. And so that is the process of design. Now keep them coming. That was a really good, that was a really good, response there. Please have more. Please have more. There's 16 of you watching. I only got one answer. And I gave this homework to everybody, so talk about it. So, yeah, and I mean, I don't know how much you watched into Great British Baking Show, but you'll notice that, and I think this is common a lot across a few of these shows, the first few challenges tend to be very straightforward and very, like, make a thing focused. And really it's almost like, think of them as curricula in a class or in a program like ours. And what you get is, like, folks will, the beginning is very much about that, like, technical training, and it's about looking at the technical part of it. So there's an element very much of, make this specific thing to show us that you are competent in making this specific thing. And, I think that's where, sort of like your design education is very representative, because, at least in the early part of our program, you do a lot of, like, make this specific thing in this specific software. And you get used to, like, proving that you can do that, right? And if you watch some of these shows, come on, 17 people, only one person actually did the homework. Tell me something. Tell me about what show you watched and what you saw. You start to see the balance of what the tasks are shift. So, I had watched that show Blown Away, which is the show about glass makers, and the beginning of similar to Bake Off, the beginning of the show is very much like, make a vase, make a cup, make a, whatever. And then towards the end of the show, when you had, like, a small number of people remaining, the prompts would get, like, really artistic. So you'd get one that's like, make a piece of glass art that, make a piece of glass art that, embodies the idea of fire. And what they were not looking for was somebody to, like, make a glass sculpture of, like, a campfire. And in fact, one guy starts doing that and then, like, says, wait, no, that's a terrible idea. That's too literal, and goes a different direction. But, it's this, that's really open-ended. And that's where you get this balance of, and to go to the first comment, you have, there is this balance, right? Of, technical is like the early stuff to kind of prove that you are competent in it. But what really pulls you ahead and keeps you there is if you get creative. So, eventually being technical isn't enough. Because in the last few episodes of this show, it's like being technical isn't enough. But to the point, the first point, but you better be competent the whole time. Because, like, in Bake Off, if you have a really great idea, if both of you have, like, equally strong ideas, but you overbake that cake, or you get the soggy bottom, or any of those things that they talk about, and, like, you don't have that craft, and I like using that term craft. I think it's a really good one, because it takes it away from, like, technical, and it turns into, like, competent making. So if the craft's not there, then, like, the bottom falls out of the idea, basically. But on the flip side, the people that are just, like, purely technical and can't do some of the creative stuff, and this actually happens to people on that other show I was watching, the glass show, where they are really there are people that kind of hold on based on their technical skill for a long time, but then what happens is like, they don't follow the brief or they do something and like, or somebody else, the other people have a better expression of the prompt and like they're lacking in the creative part, even if it's like a technical marvel, and they just kind of like fall out. There's actually a person on that show, not to spoil it, but like that we felt would just like straight up ignore some of the directions, but they're technical. I'm trying not to even spoil gender so you don't know who it is, but you'll figure it out if you watch it. They're technically so good that they just like cling to life forever, and it's one of those like you should not, that person should not still be on the show kind of situations. Forged in Fire starts with forging a particular blade. Then the final round focuses on creative aspect of forging a weapon from history. Yeah, so again, you see a shift, and it is like, I'll put it this way: when you get out in the real world, and this is like, you'll notice that a tirade that I kind of go on a lot is trying to make you all focus on the creative work as a whole. And because what happens is you're not going to, unless you get into a situation where like you are so specialized that, and this is like if you work at some massive studio and like, hey, if you can get a job doing that, like more power to you. But unless your job is super specific, the technical mastery is not going to take you all the way, because you end up in a situation where like the technical mastery is just kind of assumed. Like, of course you are really good with Maya, of course you're really good with Photoshop. Who isn't? You're going to be competing against a lot of people who are also masters of that craft part. So it's like, what do you have that takes you over that hump? And is it like you're a good communicator? Is it that you're creative? Is it that you've produced X number of games and have put them on the market, so you have knowledge of, what was it? Was it Cliff Bleszinski who said like game development is like 90% building the game and then polishing is the other 90%. So it's like there's this other 90% of your project that is more like soft skill stuff that's really hard to teach in a program, which is why like I'm making you make and launch a thing, right? Because you need that back end of, or you need that like other side of, okay, you made it, but now what are you going to do with it? And we talk in like, me and my other developers, we talk about this a lot because some of them are also teachers, and they're like, do I operate the software I operate to produce the assets I produce? Yeah, but I spend most of my time thinking about like marketing, interviewing, publishing, all these, and like making sure the creative brief goes well and stuff like that. So there's this like weird balance where it's like one part of it gets you really far, but not as far as like having that, but also having this other thing. And if you have those both things, it's really great, but like don't let the bottom fall out, because don't ever, you don't want to lose the technical, but you also don't want to rely on it. It's a double-edged sword, forged in fire. Haha. I watched a show about giant flower sculptures. Ooh, that sounds fun. Same situation with the early prompts seem more straightforward, then later tasks seems very complicated, conceptual, creative. Yeah, so again, it's you're sort of like seeing who's got it all together. Forged in Fire, creativity with weapon only worked if they could master the technical part, because if their weapon wasn't strong enough to pass testing, it didn't matter. And that's interesting, because there, where does judging on creativity and judging on technical begin? And it depends on different fields. So like the glass blowing show, and I'm talking about it a lot because that was the one that I was watching. We finished the season over the weekend. That one got really artsy and had a lot of technical discussion because it was like art school. Like I went to architecture school, and that was what we did. Is we would get a design prompt, a design brief of what kind of building it was supposed to be, what the site was. We might go visit the site if we had access to it, and then we would, but there would be some like creative aspect to it. So, I remember one prompt was actually some of the prompts that I remember really well were the ones where we had to do hotels. So one of the hotel prompts was like, create a hotel at one of these sites in the city we were in, which was Washington, D.C., and that hotel has to reimagine the concept of dwelling. And so you had to think of like, what does it mean to occupy or visit a place? And how could you change what that meant to visit a place? And this was when I was like making my transition to game designer. So I actually turned the concept of a vacation into a game. That was like, that was like the creative hook to it. It's like, you better make sure you have good drawings and your drawings are competent. But at that point, it was like assumed that of course you could do that, right? That this wasn't the project where we were training you to make, good construction drawings. That was in the past. Now it's like, all right, we want to exercise this new muscle. But at the same time, like certain things have certain objective markers. So like, you say if your weapon wasn't strong enough to pass testing. So that's interesting. Like that actually has an objective criteria. Like you have to have the ability to do something specific with that weapon, right? Food-based shows are kind of the same way, where it's like, like Bake Off is a good example of, yes, like, the creativity becomes more important throughout, but like, man, you better not overbake the thing. Like if you say you want to make puff pastry, it better not, like the butter better not come out of it, right? So there is always that thing kind of like haunting that. The one I watched, it like the technique was this unstated undertone, but it was like in later episodes they didn't really talk about it anymore. They talked about like just purely the artistic, even if it was the thing that you could tell like pushes somebody over the edge into like winning a challenge or something. So some fields have this like objective thing. I would say our field has an objective thing in terms of, is it buggy? And you've heard, if you've taken my serious games course, my games for education course, you've heard me talk about this, where you are not, like your idea can be amazing and you could be dealing with very serious issues, but if the game sucks, if you have not polished it, you're going to undermine the creative message. So that is actually where the technical, has huge impact over the creative. So that's an interesting balance there. Forged in Fire, both technical and creative. The judge were basing on how the knife was made and how well it looks, how it holds up. Okay. I watched Forged in Fire. I clearly need to check this out. There's a time limit. The contestants have to finish making the weapon. Sometimes people can fail getting a weapon done on that time limit. So that's actually really interesting about talking about the time limit, because you have time limits in this class. And why I've been asked this, not recently, but when I started teaching the class that was like the precursor to the one we have here at Kent State. I was asked by a student, can I work on one game project for the entire semester instead? And I was like, no. And why was I so emphatic about that? And the reason is because there is a skill you learn when you have a limited time frame. Is the easiest way to do this, to like replicate this experience in a classroom. But and usually in the real world it might involve time, but it might also just be like a fact of I can't get this effing feature to work. And what it is like part of, and again, this is very much a non-technical skill. This is a creative skill. It's not the artsy creative skill, but it's the skill of saying, well, I have this amount of time to produce this thing. It's either not working or I don't have enough time to produce it. So how do I design around this issue to get what I want? Or do I cut this, can I cut this feature or whatever it is? And that's really important. That is a very important part of what we do. And you'll hear game developers talk about features they cut, save it for the sequel, things like that. I purposefully only make these assignments long enough that you have to potentially like cut some ideas. Because I've worked with students a long time, and I know like, when somebody's going to say, well, we want to make a Pokemon clone. How easy is it to make a menu system and battle system? And then I explain like all the factors that go into it, and they're like, so we're cutting that feature. And that's okay. It's a good thing to know how to cut features because, I have a patch that I got from a logistics company for artists several years ago that I like framed and put in my office. Not my home office, but my like on-campus office down at Tusk. And it says real artists ship. Meaning that like, you could just delay your thing until forever. But at some point, you need to put this thing out, or else what are you even? Or else you're a hobbyist. I'll be blunt that way. Launching the thing means it's for real, and it's like when I think last year the source code for the game VVV came out for its 10-year anniversary. And everybody was like, this code is garbage. And he's like, yeah, but I shipped my game. And like, it doesn't really matter if you're missing a feature that you liked. If they don't know it's not there, then they're not going to worry about it. It doesn't matter if the code under the hood is bad because they're not looking under the hood. It doesn't matter, and it's not a car. As long as the game functions as intended when you play it and doesn't break, you're fine. Not everything has to be perfect. It just has to be. And that's important because it's like, how can I get the cake done in the amount of time? Oh, they want this kind of thing, but I only have 2 hours. Well, better make rough puff pastry instead of the classic puff pastry. That's what you deal with. Need creativity when building the flavor profile and aesthetics of your bake, but you won't get far without technical skills to back those up. I also find it really interesting because I love the way that these are phrased to be like, creative is good, but you need technical. And then there's like, technical is good, but you need creative. And I'm definitely the latter. I applied the like, but what if, voice to everybody. So everybody is equally vocalized awkwardly. But I mean, it is interesting to see, sure, X is great, but Y needs to be there. Really, the answer is both. You need to be competent at the technical, but it's like, what is going to make your thing great? And I would argue that, technical gets you the job done, but the creative makes it great. Because, it's like the thing with, if there's this old article that's, if video games were reviewed, or if movies were reviewed like video games, and it was like, boy, World War Z is sure a adequately made movie, the camera never fell down. And it's like this celebration of the stuff that in other fields is like, duh, of course you did this, because you're a professional. So it's like you need that artistic hook to, that creativity, the unique mechanic, the interesting art style, the novel aesthetic, the amazing sound profile. And you need to like raise the parts that are good and diminish the part and hide the parts that are bad, or lessen their impact, so that you can create this like really good thing. How they made Forgotten Anne in details, please. Code, animation, how to combine them. In Hell's Kitchen, first challenge is for chef to cook a signature dish. After that, each challenge is progressively more difficult. So I'll kind of leave you with this. A good example, I think, of this relationship and this balance, and like putting in the stuff you're strongest. Now it's almost like just cooking, right? Putting in the things you're most confident in, and like, diminishing the parts that you're not the most confident in. If anybody has played the game Slender, the 8 Pages, the way that game was made is, it was made in Unity. It's a project that the developer made because they were wanting to learn Unity. But the developer, I can't remember his name right off the bat, but he's a sound designer by like training and background. So, what was kind of brilliant about this game is that if you look at the art, and if you play the game, you can tell like the coding is really inefficient, and it's really kind of janky. Like it just kind of chugs in ways that a game like that, at least on, my computer from the time, which was like a decently fine computer. But it sort of like chugs in a way that a game that was made with like mostly stock Unity stuff should not chug, right? And so you can tell it was like coded really inefficiently. The 3D models are not great. There was some like submitted 3D models for things like the cars and other environment pieces that somebody the developer's friend made. Slenderman himself is like not very good as a 3D model. Even to create like a weird meme monster, it's actually kind of like an ugly 3D model. And if you compare it to like the model in the sequel that was made by a professional 3D modeler, it's like way better looking. But then there are some things in the game, like the bathhouse part of the level, that are like just kind of slapped together out of Unity primitives with a texture put on it. And the way Unity primitives would work, back then, was that they would only be UV'd a certain way, so that like on one side, the brick texture would look very nice, but then on another side of the cube, or the rectangular solid, the texture would be like really squished. So if you look at some of these places in this map, and you look at some sides of parts, like you get these awkwardly squished textures. But it's one of the best horror games I've ever played. And why? Well, let's design around the things that work and the things that don't work. What works? Sound design. Sound design is a incredibly important part of that game. If you've played it, you know this. Like the way the sound develops over time, and as like the Slender Man becomes more aggressive as you play the game, and as you get pages, that becomes like the sound design gets more intense, and everything is really effective. okay, so Slenderman's model sucks. Uh, make the mechanic to not look at him, right? If you see him, you just see this like stick figure, and then you go, oh crap, and then you turn really quickly and run. So of course, and that's at the time, in the history of this meme that became like of this horror meme, that wasn't really like an established thing. Oh, sorry. How they made Forgotten Anne, and I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know how they made Forgotten Anne. That I don't know a lot about the development of that game to be able to tell you. So yeah, I'm not one of the developers of that game. So the way that what was I talking about? Yeah, so like in this story that this ghost story online, there were like elements of this, but it wasn't really codified that like you can't look at him or you'll go crazy or you'll go and he'll pull you into Slender Land or whatever. So that was kind of added in the game. It's like, okay, make the mechanic to look away from the bad 3D model. To get around the environment art, well, one, it's a horror game, so it should be dark, but it's also dark, so you can't see necessarily the bad artwork as well as you could in, there's eventually like a daytime mode where you can walk around in that forest in daytime, and you really get to see just not like how, bad some of those textures and things are. But again, it's okay because the game is pitch black. So it's like the game is designed to mute the parts that would be like... Because here's the thing. If you were trying to present this game and you didn't have those things like diminished, it doesn't matter how good the design or how good the sound is. Something would take you away because... that is that like the craft is bad, so it's going to yank you out of the experience. But to work around the craft of parts being not as great, the designer like made things dark, made it so that you don't look at things for very long, and then raised other parts of it, and then it became like this classic horror game. So that's really important because sometimes you don't have enough time to polish everything to a mere shine. Sometimes you've just got to like hide it under the rug a little bit. And that's okay. We all do it. So it's like the balance of the creative, the technical, but also the skill of production to know how to heighten the things that are good about your project and lower the things that are bad. Also helps for making trailers. Editing is magic. Okay, so if there are no other questions, then what I want to do with the rest of our time is I'm going to talk about Project 2, and then I'm going to try to get through some of this interactive narrative stuff. So Project 2, let me make sure that... Okay, quit. Project 2, and I've released your team assignments yesterday. All the teams are named after pasta. So Project 2 is one in which you are making a game in the GB Studio engine. And you are making a game, it's a narrative-based game, where you have to... The game concept is based around the idea of going to run an errand / going to the store. Okay, so here's that technical creative. So what's the balance here? Team Spaghetti supremacy. I don't know. I really like vermicelli. I actually love spaghetti. I like vermicelli too. Any games just like that? I mean, sorry, person who just keeps asking about this game. With all due respect, you'll have to ask the developers of those games. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm making a hand-drawn animated game, but, if you're asking like how those are specifically constructed, you'll have to ask the developers of the games. I'm teaching a class. So, like, you're welcome to watch, but I can't answer questions about those right now. Sorry. So when you're making this game, I want you to think about a few different things. You have an end goal, which is, presumably you are trying to, get to the store or get a thing from the store, like, go buy bread, go buy peanut butter, whatever. And you can tell my brain is in lunchtime mode. And, but you need to think about, like, what you should not do, because it's technically against the, other aspects of the project. You shouldn't be like, okay, make the character get, like, walk to store, get peanut butter, walk out of store. That would be, like, boring and lame, right? And again, there's that, like, you could confidently prove your technical skill by making something like that, but that's not what we want. We want you to make something interesting with the with this prompt. So what does that mean? Well, you're going to think about, like, what is the structure of long and short-term goals, and how is that going to affect, like, the player experience? In the example that I provide, to teach, like, the tutorial video that I did to teach GB Studio, I don't specifically do a store-based plot, because I was just like, I was working with assets I have and I don't have a store. But, the idea of, like, you have to go and get into the cave, but to get into the cave, you have to prove yourself by doing, like, 3 acts of kindness. And then what are those acts of kindness are, like, short-term. So you have, like, okay, end goal, cave, mid goal, acts of kindness, and then you go up to each of the NPCs that assign you these act of kindness quests, and they give you, like, an immediate thing, like, find my cat, or find the cool rocks, or help me find my brother, or something like that. So you have short, mid, and long-term goals, and you even have some crossover, because, like, in one of the quests, to find the 3 cool rocks, one of the rocks is hidden behind the guy who wants you to find his cat. So you've got to find his cat to get him to move out of the way to get to the rock. So you can, like, nest these things, and that makes it more interesting and feel more interactive and exploratory. So you're focusing on pacing of goals, pacing of challenges, pacing of puzzles. You're focusing on level to structure. You might have a level that you want to be linear because it tells a set story from beginning to end. Maybe you want it to be something where, like, it doesn't have to be huge, but you wander a bit. And maybe you have, like, go find the 3 things, and then the 3 things are kind of, like, in disparate parts of a bigger map. A game like Hollow Knight does that really well, where it's like, okay, to get into the black egg, you've got to, go find the 3 sleeping, I can't remember what they're called, the 3 sleeping characters. But they're kind of, like, around the map, and you can tackle them really in any order you want. So there's a lot of wandering in a game like that, because it is so unstructured, and that can be really nice if you like those sorts of games. So you think about, like, do you pass through a play? Do you limit backtracking, or do you have a little bit of backtracking so that maybe, like, you see a town change or something like that? Maybe that's, maybe it's like you do the errand multiple times, but, like, when you're 10 and then 13 and then 16 and then, like, 35 or so, I don't know. Like, how's the, maybe you come up with, like, the environment changes or something like that. So you want to run with this idea of going to the store. I don't want it to just be, like, straightforward. I want you to kind of think, like, what kind of zany, you can go kind of zany and manic with it. I used the example yesterday of, like, Okay, I got to go to the store. Where's my keys? Oh no, the baby has the keys. Oh no, the baby wandered outside because the door was open. Okay, chase the baby. Oh no, aliens abducted the baby. Got to go fight the aliens. So you can do stuff like that, or I guess maybe not fight if you don't want to like develop a combat system in it. So yeah, you can go off the wall with this. But you're looking at how something like variables and goals and game structure creates story, basically. You're discovering the differences between sort of like embedded story, the story that's like beginning to end, versus like story that happens because you're playing a game. And then, the other thing you're learning is how to work within strong limitations. So this goes into GB Studio. So why GB Studio in particular? Well, GB Studio's, it's not an engine that you're necessarily going to get work in. It depends. Like if somebody funds a GB Studio game for like hundreds of thousands of dollars, they could hire people if they wanted to. But it's not something that like, is a big job creator. And most game engines are not. Like, let me clarify this. You're not wasting your time in that way. You could argue the same thing about Unity and Unreal, where apart from like out of the industry applications like architecture or AR, VR, or like, kind of halfway in the industry, AR, VR, like industry adjacent, I guess we can call them, training, simulations, things like that. Most big game studios will just make their own engine. It's not necessarily that there is one engine that's like it's not Photoshop, it's not Maya or 3D Studio Max. And even that's kind of a gamble where people are doing their 3D because there's also Cinema 4D, Blender, and all these other things that people do. So game engines are even less standardized. So why do you learn a tool like this? Well, part of it is like sometimes you just need learning lots of game engines. And this learning lots of game engines is a good way to understand when you need to prototype an idea. This is game prototyping, after all, or if you sorry, lost my train of thought. This is game prototyping. If you need a prototyping tool, you can grab one of these engines like we did with Twine. Or if you are working on a creative project and it is kind of like open-ended, you're just like making a game. If you're making a game to make a game, to launch a game, like people want to see something creative and something that you've launched. They don't, it's not like everybody is rating your, individual indie games on like how good you are at Unity, or how good you are at Unreal. It's just sort of like, hey, let me see your game. And then whatever your game is, people will judge it based on, the game itself, not the game as it relates to the engine you made it in. So you can make like your own games in whatever. And the way you should be making these choices, and I say this because like I even had conversations about this a similar thing related to animation in it with our capstone students the other day. I would have people say, "Oh man, okay, I've done my paper. Now should my project be 2D or 3D?" And I'm like, I don't know. You tell me. And I wasn't being difficult. It was like, well, okay, so why don't you make a storyboard and look at what kind of visuals you want to make, look at the scope you want, look at the production realities of it, of the intended piece of art you want to make. And then from that, basically write your movie and then come up with like, based on the production realities and the time I have, I want to make it in, Maya, Unreal, Blender 2D, stop motion, whatever. So let your creative idea be the driver in this. So I'm doing that for you a little bit. GB Studio was originally developed to create, I would say, like RPG town fetch questy type games. And so it's a good engine for that kind of game. So I'm kind of like relieving you of the duty of making that engine choice by making it for you in a way to model, to like be able to talk about why I made that choice so that I'm modeling that behavior for you. So when you in the future are creating your own self-driven project, like in Capstone, you will do a similar thing where you develop your creative idea and then you look at your tools available to you and you say, this one will help and that one will help and that one will help because I will be able to make my creative dream happen. Instead of, again, blindly opening one piece of software or the other. So it's not about software. It's about creativity. Software supports it. That's it. But then the other thing that I want you to understand is, and this is where another aspect of these shows comes in that we talked about, which is like they connect with the creativity, not necessarily with, so another aspect of these shows comes in, which is the design prompts. So, and how people deal with them. So the beginning design prompts are kind of limited, easy prompts. They are make a bowl, make a cake make a wedding cake. It is of a certain type of thing, right? Make a knife. I remember like we watched a little bit of Forged in Fire, and it was like make a knife on this specific type of a heating element. And so like that was a very specific challenge. I think they even said like make this specific kind of knife. I can't remember. But that is like one-to-one technical, right? But why you do that is that you need to learn as a creator to work within a box. And working in a box is good because if you immediately, and this is why I always have a problem with people just like opening a piece of software, because they focus on the software first and not on the idea first. Because what they've not done is they've not developed the box that, the rules that they want to create within. And what you end up doing is that you assume that the software is part of the box, or the idea and the software start to fight, and you get frustrated and you waste time because you realize that the software is, you're trying to make the software do something it doesn't like to do, and then you actually waste time in your production instead of if you had like built your set of rules for your creative project and then picked your tool, right? So working with constraints is really important. And when you see those challenges, they give them constraints, but they want to see what comes out of the constraints. So make a wedding cake, but where does creativity come out of wedding cake with the flavors or the decorations or whatever? And then you get something similar with, and eventually like the constraints fall away and you just have make fire. But then it's incumbent upon the maker to be like, well, I'm going to focus on this, and this technique. And then that is their rules. So it goes from all rule giving, let me provide you with the box and the constraints, to less of a box, less constraints, but then the first step is that the creator will make their own set of constraints to live in to supplement the small amount of constraints. And then that squeezes the creativity out. So building your box and to work within, building your constraints and coming up with your constraints is super important in a creative project. So let's talk constraints. I'm giving you constraints. So you have creative, you have limited creative constraints. You can you have to do going to shop or going to run an errand. But things are mostly open-ended. I was asked yesterday, are there limitations on setting? And I would actually say, and I can repeat this in the class Discord, I would not like you to use cliche game settings. So leave out sci-fi, fantasy, post-apocalyptic. Try to limit, try to come up with something else. Horror isn't really a setting. It's an emotion. So you can do a horror game. But, again, just don't do horror in space or horror in post-apocalyptic, do there's a game that is one of the listed games. It's horror in, I don't know, the rural mountains or something like that. And so that, it's a little, I don't want to spoil it, but it's a little interesting because of that. So you want to have, but the box you do have to work within is GB Studio itself. And here's why. I want to see how far you can go with limited, I guess, visual and power resources. So you're used to these engines that give you the ability to do anything. And what happens when you have the ability to do anything is you get lost thinking you can do anything, and you overscope and you make something too big, and then you might not finish it because it's too big. And you shot for the moon in something that let you think you could do that. And this is why I always get nervous whenever a company like Unity or Unreal puts out a video where they're you can just load in your ZBrush models. It's oh no. There's no constraints, and that's when I get these things that are here's my level, look at my level that I've sent you. And I download the level file, or I look in Google Drive and it's 20 gigabytes. And I'm that is not one level. But it is, because the blue sky strikes again. Limitless possibilities strike again. So what you have is the opposite. You have very limited resources. GB Studio makes I forgot my Game Boy again. GB Studio makes games that run on original Game Boy hardware. It launches Game Boy ROMs. So that's kind of fun. You can make your own Game Boy games. So what does that mean? Well, it means that what's on your screen can only be 160 by 144. It's anti-HD. That means that there are only 4 colors. There's actually 5 colors, but sprites can use one set of 4 colors, and background objects can use another set of 4 colors. And again, I put the color palette documentation up in the Discord. But you can so you have to make sprites and animation in 4 colors. Speaking of sprites, you can only have in a scene 30 objects, which, I don't know, might sound like a lot, might sound like not a lot, based on, what your perception of how scenes are built are. But to add on that, only 10 objects can be on the screen at one time, or else you'll get animation glitching. And the engine will let you know if there's a possibility that you're going to have too many things on screen at one time. So you need to learn to make concise, no frills, lean gameplay. You got to cut the fat. And that's the problem when you do have those blue sky things and I'm handed a 20 gigabyte level, is that it's just all fat. It's just all extra stuff that doesn't need to be there. And, the gameplay sometimes is really unclear. This is going to focus you into working with limited resources. If that wasn't enough for you, you also cannot have in one scene any more than 25 frames of animation for everything in the scene. So if you have 30 objects, they have to somehow only occupy 25 frames of animation. Again, or else you're going to get like a crash and massive visual glitching. So again, why am I doing this? Because I want you to, so two things. One, that's a creative box. I want you to show me what you can do to make your game like elevate out of that creative box and be really interesting. Do you focus on narrative and story and writing? Are your characters like, can you squeeze expressiveness out of that? Do you come up with some gameplay mechanic that is just really good? Like, I'm only really expecting, and as you see in the brief when you read it, I'm expecting you really only to have to use stock stuff that comes with the engine, but you can make a lot more. So like maybe you do try to like push it a little bit. Is your art style unique? Whatever, it's up to you, but push against the boundaries of that box. It's a small box though, so you don't have to go far. So let me see where you take it. The other thing that I want you to learn is, because it is so visually limited, this is an art direction project. You are learning how to conform to an art style. The art style just happens to be, limited by the actual software itself. In the next project, you're going to have a similar challenge to conform to an art style based on a retro game, but the engine will not push back. So, you could get away with stuff, but I'll be watching. And if something's off, you better have a good reason for it. Whereas here, it's letting you practice that by actually correcting you. So I'll let you go through some of these things, but your requirements are: game should be should be one player, based on narrative, trip to the store to run an errand. Again, no cliche game settings, sci-fi, fantasy, post-apocalyptic, things like that. Allow players to take on the role of at least one character in the story. Players must have at least 4 quests to fulfill. So that, quest like 1 could be go get the peanut butter. That's the long-term goal. Maybe that's quest 1. Quest 2 could be like, how do I get into the store? Do the 3 things. That could be quest 2. The 3 things, 1, 2, 3. So that's 5 quests. So you could, the long-term, short-term goals can all be quests. But, you need to have at least 4 quests. And there is a quest tracking system in the example project, and that I show you in the tutorial video. Should be structured in a hierarchical manner, long-term, short-term goals. So think about how short-term goals feed into mid-term goals, feed into long-term goals, and how you make the player aware of those. And then you should have at least 7 scenes in the game. So 7 rooms, locations, whatever, however you want to structure it. But there should be 7 scenes. I'm going to be evaluating you on, are the goals structured interestingly? Do you make a good game? Does it flow well? Is there not a ton of annoying elements? Do the challenges make sense? Game has meaning and interesting narrative. Just make a good story. And then, do you present it well? And then for project resources, I do suggested readings. Top Twine games, even though we're not doing Twine, they're still games that use story in really cool ways with gameplay elements. And then there are 3 games that are GB Studio games with really nice use of story. Some of which do actually have these kind of fetch questy social ideas. And then there's 2 articles. One, Game Design is Narrative Architecture by Henry Jenkins. Another, Metrics of Space Molecule Design, that talk about space and storytelling and spatial layout. So any questions from my students that are watching this about the project? While I wait for your response, I'm actually going to roll through this real quick. so that we don't have to come back Thursday. So please ask me questions in the chat. I will respond to them. None so far. Cool. I'm gonna roll through this real quick. So, and we've talked about mechanics mostly throughout this semester. But we've left this other part out. Now, again, we know that this is not all there is to where game ideas come from. There is this there's do you have a mission or unique hardware or novelty or whatever. There's all these other things, and it's all based on player experience. But if we do, maybe look at it as this duality, right? And this is actually a whole thing in game studies, was this fight between people who understood games as play versus people who understood games as story, which was silly but also kind of toxic. So we're not going to focus on that too much. Somebody says, I feel like we'll have more questions as we work on the project. That's why I structure the projects the way I do, so they inspire questions and discussion. So good. Yes, have questions as you work. Thoughtful you'll have technical questions, but thoughtful questions too. Think about the content, and then we'll, these are meant to spur conversation. That I never just want you to make a thing in software. I always want you to make something thoughtful and artful. So there's this whole toxic fight about this that we're not going to focus on too much, but know that there is this perceived duality. But in reality, games can be a really great storytelling medium specifically because of their playability. So the perceived duality is always you either have Final Fantasy, where it is a point A, point B, point C story, or you have Fortnite, where it's just you play, and then maybe you tell a story at the end. But it's not just that. We have this idea of interactive narrative, which is a form of procedural experience, rule-based experience, where players create or influence a dynamic story through your actions. So for now, we're going to focus on two types of narrative. One of that is embedded narrative, where it is you have a story that is authored to be a set point A, point B, point C narrative that cannot be changed. This is not a spoiler. You cannot save Aerith. In the original Final Fantasy VII, I actually have to say that now because of the remake. You cannot save her, right? You can't. The cutscene is rendered and made and animated and put onto the disc. There's no choice there. It is a story scene. And, you get these examples where gameplay stops and you watch story. Now, games like this, Half-Life 2, and now this became kind of a trend and almost to the point of a cliche, but when Half-Life 2 came out, it was a big deal that you would go to a place in a story and then the game would not be taken away from you to watch the characters interact. They would kind of walk around as though it was a play, but then you were there on the stage in the play, and you didn't have to, stay, and you could choose to be part of the play and walk around and be attentive to the scene. Okay, so it says that I'm still streaming. Okay, it does look like yeah, that looks right. So, yeah, Half-Life, there was this blend of play and like, a story from the fact that it kind of let you pull away from the story, and that was really interesting for a while. And a lot of games started doing it. And that starts to poke at like this other thing that we get, which is called emergent narrative, which is story elements created through a player's interaction with the game's systems. So who is your Gordon Freeman? That's up to you. It's emergent. And I'm not going to show these videos simply because they'll like eat up time and that we don't have because of the delay. But then also, it's hard to stream through a stream. But, there is like Dr. Kleiner's lab. It's, story about like, it's a video about like, being kind of manic while this like story sequence is going on. There's also this game called Facade. That I think is an even better example of a narrative, like emergent narrative system that is really focusing on story. Because I can say like, you'll play Fortnite or PUBG or Among Us, and like there is a story that comes out because you are playing this game, right? In the same way that like there could be a story that happens in like baseball, but that is like the sort of play-by-play announcing version of story, emergent narrative. There is like a game like Facade, which if you've not played before, is this AI experiment in storytelling from faculty at UC Santa Cruz. Where you are a guest at a couple's apartment for a dinner party, but what you don't know is that they are in the middle of a big fight. And what you do like basically makes stuff happen in the AI, and then it like story stuff happens as a result. So this system is so open-ended that, it became a meme. Like, 10 years or something after it was created, it became a meme because people would discover the system and discover, like, basically mess with it. And then that would make the characters do stuff. So again, but it's packaged in a way that, again, it's not like, well, how did you deal with this puzzle? Or how did you deal with that puzzle? It's a story. It creates a new version of this social situation of going to your friend's house when they're in a fight. So what does this point to? Well, there's this concept of a possibility space, which is how much emergence or possibility can happen in your game. A game where... And related to this is like the illusion of choice. How do you, if you don't have the ability to create lots of emergence through different systems, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second, how do you create the illusion that there's choice and emergence? So let's take into account the maps of two Final Fantasy games. The original Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy 13. So Final Fantasy games are always linear. They always have a story that takes you from point A to point B to point Z. They always have stuff that you cannot change. What's his name will always become Chaos in Final Fantasy 1. Cecil will always go from being a Dark Knight to a Paladin in 4. The world will always get blown up in 6. Aerith will always die. There will always be one wing and eight, all that stuff. Like, you always play Blitzball, whatever. That always happens in these games. But because of the world design, you always fight God in the end. Sometimes literally if you're playing Dragon Quest or Shin Megami Tensei. But, the way that the world is structured, even if you do have a limited chunk of world to play in, you get the illusion of choice because, you can go fight monsters, you can go grind experience to get limit breaks, you can go do side quests, or you can go, like, tackle the main quests. But you have, like, a space to occupy where you can make some choices. Some choices matter more than others, but it gives you the illusion that you are not totally on a track. Final Fantasy 13 is hallways and cutscenes. You know, it doesn't really have that. It gets rid of the illusion and just becomes, again, like mostly 25 hours of hallways and cutscenes. I don't like 13 that much. So, you know, this can be related to a very simple version of this is like number of branches. If we look at the twines we made, you know, you can regulate story through numbers of branches of story. So that's like the alternate ending thing. So the easiest alternate ending is like light side, dark side, right? You know, do you become a Jedi or a Sith? So this is from Jedi Knight. If you don't know it, it's great. Great old 90s FPS, but with Star Wars. But then you can get something like this, where you get like dialogue trees. And, you know, if you give enough choices, it will really start to feel like you have more branches to go on, even if they ultimately hit the same story beats. So, you know, this can be like a narrative management system in the background. You know, it could be as simple as like branching paths in a choose your own adventure or conversation situation. Or you could go full on narrative management system and have this tied to variables instead of just like go to page 44, go to page 35. You know, so you get a game like Depression Quest where because of choices you make in this person's life, it turns on or off specific variables in the under the hood of the game, and that leads to you know, parts of the game maybe being cut off from you because, like, you know, the way the game works is that if you do something or choose not to do something, and, you know, maybe like the healthy way out of a social situation would be cut off for you, it would have strike through text and you couldn't click it, and that would turn into like this sort of third narrative where you've got you know, there's the narrative of the game. There's like these scripted story pieces that, you know, are turned into this network of choose your own adventure. But you've got the emergent narrative of like, well, which of those do you see because of your gameplay choices? So that's emergent. But then you've got this like meta narrative of this conflict between like, if you're playing this, you're maybe like rooting for the person to make the healthy choice, but the healthy choice is denied you. So then it becomes this like gameplay experience narrative, and perhaps empathy building narrative. And that can become like this weird third meta narrative. So that, you know, that's why this is like a really powerful experience, because it does like create this tension between, you know, the different narratives. Or you get something that is fully just like emergent open, where the same thing never happens twice because it is generated out of parts by like an AI system, like in Prom Week, that some of my friends who studied at UC Santa Cruz, this is like their thing, is like AI and narrative. But, you know, this is, you know, part of their whole, you know, that's how their game functions. It actually like runs a narrative under the hood for you. So what are my tips? Because you don't have the ability to write a system like Sif to manage your narratives in the next few weeks. So what should you do? Well, focus on a few things. Think about what are the verbs in your story, because that might be a good place to start in terms of like, what are the things that are available to you in the tool you're using, and how can that help you craft a story? So if there's something that you can build, how can you start to string narrative together out of these events that are created through gameplay? How can your writing direct or influence player activity? You know, how can you, you know, it's not just storytelling. Sometimes like the storytelling has to give the player clues or context, you know, so maybe it's like, hey, you know, have you found this yet? All those little indicators of like, oh, okay, I should go find that tool. That's something that'll help you write. Same thing with can you do anything to make the story more expansive? So like I'm working on a prototype for a GB Studio game that I'm working on right now, where one of the objects in the game is a rake. So you take the rake, and when you get the rake, it doesn't just say you got the rake, it says you got the rake, and at least you didn't step on it this time, to do like the rake gag thing. But like that adds a little fun to it. Like it's not a story event or a flashback or a cutscene. It's just like a little thing that makes you think, oh, this guy's clumsy. So you can do stuff like that very easily, very cheaply. What story elements can be turned into variables? Aha! Can we do something where, maybe it's like you did this quest or you didn't do the quest, or you did the healthy choice and that turns off other healthy choices, like for depression quest, and how does that turn into gameplay? What can become switches or numbers or variables or strings in your game? That can be really important and nice. And then lastly, how do variables affect narrative events? When you have all these back-end things that maybe can switch on or off or change or, work in different ways, what does that do? Is it lock and key? Is it, does it change the morality? Does it make characters have different lines? What does it do? And how does that affect the gameplay experience? This is stuff you can do. And I actually find it very simple with this engine. So if there's questions, I can take them on Discord, because, we had a delay and everything. So, but thank you for watching. I hope this was enjoyable. I hope the project is clear to you. And again, there are resources in different parts of the Discord that I pointed out or sent yesterday that will help you get started on Project 2. So I'm really excited. It's a fun engine to work with. You can iterate on it pretty quickly, or with it pretty quickly. And, there is a nice, like, it is a cool art style once you get into it. So I'm looking forward to what you make. And that's it. Have a good week. Go play in the snow.